joining this ICASID webinar, and the topic the topic for today is inclusive online education, and our presenter will be Professor Saurabh Sina. Please let me know a little about Saurabh. Saurabh obtained his bachelor and master degree and PhD degrees in electronic engineering from the University of Pretoria, and as an established researcher rated by the National Research Foundation in South Africa, he has authored or co-authored over 130 publications in peer-reviewed journals, books, and international conference. On October the 4th, in 2013, Professor Senior appointed as Executive Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment at the University of Johannesburg. As of December the 1st in 2017, Professor Sina is the UGA Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Internationalization. Professor Sina also served the 2014-2015 period IEEE Board of Directors and as IEEE Vice President of Educational Activities Board. So please welcome to Professor Saurabh Sina.
Thanks very much, Jose. You want me to get started with the talk, right? So thank you very much, Jose, for that introduction. I'll get going with the presentation. Firstly, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to present a topic which would have in the past been just a topic on online education. I use the word inclusive online education because I think there are certain opportunities that emerge, and they emerge particularly because in the era of the COVID-19 period. And at the moment, you know, South Africa is in a phase of lockdown. And I suspect that a number of you, wherever you are, you may also be in a period of, or in some form of lockdown, or you may be having certain precautionary measures when it comes to COVID-19. Now, when pandemics hit the world, there is an old saying that it hits the world like a crisis, and Winston Churchill had at one point said that never let a good crisis go to a waste. And so what we have been trying to look at is, you know, how do we actually evolve online education, something that many institutions have been trying to do around the world with different levels of success. And while I was doing this, I thought I'm going to step back and reflect a little. And in this reflection, I want to share with you a particular quotation from author Arundhati Roy. And I'm not going to read the whole text. The text is available through Financial Times. And I'll read one or two paragraphs. And one of the things that she says that helps us reflect perhaps today is that whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us the chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Now, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. this one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And I thought that this was an interesting and an important reflection to where we perhaps maybe in the world. And I brought about this picture as it gives us a glimpse in terms of a portal and how worlds sometimes evolve. The current world and the previous world. Now, in retrospection, I thought to engage you briefly on a text which is written by Thomas Friedman. And Thomas Friedman's text is called "Thank You for Being Late." Now, I had the chance to meet Thomas when he visited South Africa last year. And one of the things that he had mentioned, that when he thought about this particular book, he was at a restaurant and he was waiting for a friend, and that was while he was in New York. And people tend to sometimes be late in New York simply because of traffic and the pace of life in New York. And he then had a chance to pause. And it was in that moment of pause that he started to write and scribble down some text, which eventually led to the text which became "Thank You for Being Late." It's a good text to look at because it brings about a moment of pause, perhaps the kind of pause that many around the world experience during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, this is a reflection, and I'm going back slightly in time, and this is something that you're all familiar with, is that this graph plots the rate of change of human adaptability versus time. And what you'd see is that human adaptability has in fact occurred over time. But if you look at technology also has had a fairly exponential curve. And this point of where technology has perhaps started to leap ahead of human adaptability in terms of the rate of change, this point might be just before 2008. It would be in the region of 2007 when you had all these new advances. For example, the iPad came up at the time, Facebook came up at the time. There were numerous advances at the time that we did not realize, but would in fact have a profound evolution when it comes to technology. So we continue to see this curve, and it is not that human adaptability has not been there. So what we have been trying to do at the University of Johannesburg is we've been looking at contextualizing the university's strategy for the fourth industrial revolution. Internally, we call that the strategy GES 4.0, which stands for the Global Excellence and Stature Strategy. Now, the 4.0 is an interesting component because it enables human adaptability to leapfrog and take benefit of the technological revolution. Now, the technological revolution, to some extent, has in fact been expedited because of different measures of lockdown that has emanated around the world with COVID-19. Of course, although there are many positives of this, it also means that there are some negatives. Now, I'll show you some pictures to try and give you the context. So perhaps before I go there, I'm still contextualizing. And in this context, I want to go back a few years ago in 2015. The world adopted, a number of countries that are member states of the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals they're a set of 17 goals. But if it allows, these goals allow us to stand back and look at the world differently. So whatever situation we are analyzing, the situation can be analyzed and reviewed in terms of techno-economic implications, in terms of geopolitical implications, in terms of Earth systems, and in terms of social dynamics. So if you had to analyze COVID-19, these lenses that are offered here may give you different perspectives. You may find today that we have an impact on the humanities and social sciences directly in your own local area because of lockdown provisions. But separately, you may find that we're no longer able to travel as easily. Travel has got implications. Immigration has got implications. So the social dynamics as a result of that changes. Geopolitically, we saw, a heightened view of what has been, could China have informed the world sooner in terms of COVID-19? Did China do its best? What were the views of the World Health Organization? Then the United Nations, the United States came up, and the United States had its views initially, which we also saw change over the last 3 months. And so there came the geopolitical considerations. Now, while we've had these lockdown provisions, it also became interesting that the environment had favorable implications as we reduced our travel, as we reduced movement and interaction with the environment as we would conventionally do. There were also techno-economic implications. There were rumors of whether COVID-19 and 5G technology has a connection. And of course, we know that it is not the case. But it did come up, and it may have come about because of these interrelated connections. But the point of this slide, and maybe the takeaway for the audience, is that if we look at the world, whether we're analyzing COVID-19 or we're analyzing other situations with these four lenses of geopolitics, of Earth system social dynamics, and techno-economics, we're able to bring about a holistic picture that helps us to design solutions that minimize unintended consequences. Now, so what we saw prior to COVID-19 was the recognition that the way that we are doing education today does need to evolve. We found that, in our own case at the University of Johannesburg, we have been infusing artificial intelligence across multiple disciplines, as today we find technology having an impact on all the modules and programs that a university has to offer. We then found that over the December and particularly late January period, that COVID-19 became quite prominent. We started to understand what the implications are, what it means for our students who are pursuing study abroad in China, and it evolved very quickly as the pandemic, it was declared a pandemic, it started to move into Europe. We then started to concern about students who may be in Europe, students who may be traveling from Europe to South Africa. And we started to wonder that this very important aspect of diversity, which enables quality in our programs, in our academic programs, that this diversity has the potential for compromise. We then started to see that all sorts of measures got introduced during different type of lockdown. For example, physical distancing, the utilization of personal protection equipment, sanitizing grew into prominence. At the same time, we recognized the deep health crisis that we have. And at the same time, we are also in a financial crisis, and the variation of that financial crisis, of course, tends to differ from country to country. But what is clear is that how we have viewed the economic situation in one part of the world, and the world is much more connected than ever before, is that the economic situation will change. Now, what would the post-COVID-19 period look like? We can, of course, wait and hope that, maybe one view is that, and I often hear that, when things would become normal. We were talking about it at the university in one of our meetings today, and somebody mentioned, one of my colleagues mentioned, well, when we can all go back to the university. And in our reflection, we reflected, well, we can't really say that because we don't know what will be and when will be the readiness in terms of the vaccine. We do not know what type of immunity will develop. We do not know yet what is the meaning of immunity in the context of COVID-19. It is too early to be able to deduce whether a particular antibody is effective. What is the tau? What is the lifespan of the antibody that that people who are recovering, what type of antibody do they attain? These are unknowns at this point. So what we have also been seeing at this time is that more people are working from home. where the possibility remains, which is not possible for everyone. And these variations are also common around the world. Now, I want to give you a picture of South Africa. And this is a picture from Cape Town. And Cape Town is, of course, a very beautiful city. And on the right-hand side, you can see one very beautiful picture of Cape Town. On the left-hand side, the same city, these two pictures are taken perhaps about 15 minutes apart if you were driving. And what you see is the city which also has deep poverty. Beautiful first world economy infrastructure in parts of the city, and the same city having on the left very poor conditions. So when we are talking about developing education solutions, how do we contend and develop education solutions in a country with these deep contrasts? Perhaps it is also reflective of a world where there are deep contrasts of different kinds. Does it mean that these inequalities will be more emphasized than ever before when we look at these online solutions? Will there be people who will have a benefit of education, and will the rich become richer in education and otherwise, and the poor become poorer? So the aspect of digital inequality has then been emphasized. Now, what we have done as a university is we have made available data provision as well as device provision for people who do not have the affordability. But at the same time, we don't have all the answers, because we know that some of our students are living in very poor areas where, despite the fact that they may have device and data, they may not have the connectivity, there may not be a mobile network. Or if they do have a mobile network, they may be staying in a house that does not enable, the environment does not enable one that is conducive to learning. So this is kind of the context that we're trying to grapple with. And although this is a situation in South Africa now, on the other hand, what has been happening at the university? We've been having some really interesting kind of things that we've not experienced in the past. We've been experiencing the development of personal protection equipment. We've had 3D printing of face masks. We've had 3D printing of different type of masks. We've been experimenting with filters. And in the end, we have decided that not everybody requires these very sophisticated type of masks or surgical masks. Those are required more by health professionals. And the cloth masks may be in fact adequate for a number of people who have less contact or have less susceptibility to the disease, particularly if everybody is consistently wearing these masks and are also washing their hands and ensuring that there's good sanitizing facilities that's available. And some of these sanitizers were also produced by the university by using the formula from the World Health Organization. What was also interesting is some of the design work that you've seen, fully recognizing, by the way, that the 3D printing is not necessarily a scalable solution. We also designed some ventilators because ventilators are quite expensive, and you will have access to this link if you want to follow how to look at these cost-effective ventilators. But what was interesting in all of this is that the world came together, and we started to leverage an open source movement. An open source movement, which we have not always been sure about, whether, we've sometimes contested it because educational material has been seen as intellectual property and we have been protective about it. Now, what we have seen during this crisis, this period of crisis, is that when humanity has such a need to try to save and protect itself, we come together and we see how we can practice and we can have best practice that comes together. Now, there are groups such as on Facebook that has open source material that is available, which progresses very quickly in terms of medical supplies and how it can be produced in a cost-effective way. And so there is an important component here, and the takeaway from these three slides is that despite our challenges as a globe, we find that we have explored new innovations, and we have come together and we have explored open source more than ever before. Not that we didn't do it in the past, but it is now kind of accelerated. So in a way, COVID-19 has helped us to accelerate this angle, which we may have struggled with. On the other hand, there are certain components like this particular meeting that we're having. We're actually having it over an online medium, and a lot of the things which we always argued upon, that there must have in-person presence. It is not that we are saying that those in-person engagements must be replaced, but what is interesting is our ability to be more conducive to augmented ways of thinking. Now, at the university, we often had flexibility for academic staff to work from home, for instance, from time to time, but we did not have that flexibility for professional support staff. We often expected that professional support staff will come and work from the university. And suddenly, what we are finding now is that people must work from home. And we are finding that individuals who we had expected would not be able to perform from home and from their environments are surprising us. In some cases, they're able to be much more productive from their environments. And we're also finding that the limitations of the situation has enabled them to be creative in ways that we haven't seen before. So that's an interesting angle. And of course, we start to see a new dimensions of the environment because we require more power, we require better telecommunication infrastructure. So if we have to take the lenses that we used earlier on to look at COVID-19, and if we have to look at higher education in the same way, we start to get new perspectives about higher education. We start to realize, one realization that we had as a university the other day was that, yes, University of Johannesburg, we are moving a lot of our programs online, but on the other hand, our sister university is doing the same. At the same time, there is another sister university not so far from here, which is unable to do the same because their infrastructure is different to ours. And so when we started to look at this, we started to say, well, perhaps there is opportunity to cooperate and not have duplication between us. Now, while we're having this conversation within our boundary in South Africa, which is, it's a big country, but it has only 26 public universities, so not that many. If you compare it to the United States, compare it to China, you compare it to India, you compare it to countries with larger populations, it becomes smaller. Then we, of course, receive a lot of students from the within the continent of Africa. And a number of these students are unable to access to visit us in person because of these lockdown measures. And in some cases, the students return to their home. And so there is also a geopolitical and a techno-economic implication that came about. But while we are doing these things online, you find that a leading university in another part of the world is doing the same. Now, we have to be very competitive, or we have to be sufficiently collaborative so that post-COVID, post this period of COVID-19, nothing stops another institution from entering into our domain and providing a service which is very competitive, because we find that the borders that we have, not that they were not virtualizing in the past, but they now are much more virtual because of COVID-19, much more than ever before. So it forces us to actually start to think collaboratively, as we also realize that our business models can actually be significantly challenged post-COVID. We already see that some of our international students who pursued qualifications in South Africa was perhaps due to the cost that they were paying a lower fee, but for high quality of higher education. But now the cost margins are starting to become reduced, and other players are entering the market. So this is really becoming a challenge if we think about it in the same way. On the other hand, if we start to say, how do we customize, how do we localize, and how do we cooperate to bring the global aspect, we start to see new collaborations. One example of that is a virtual mobility program that we've been looking at to try to replace study abroad, as that was very important when it comes to diversity, as students went into other places to learn and experience. But you know, we could only send so many students because there was limitation of budget. But suddenly we are able to send more students if we're able to think virtually. And perhaps there are some students who will be able to travel once again, once we have, we are in the post-COVID-19 environment, but they would have a deeper engagement when they're traveling because of all these online interactions that have suddenly developed. Of course, there's also a social aspect to it, is that especially in countries where there's deep inequality, that while there are areas that are progressing in an online way, there are other areas that are deeply suffering because they do not have food, they do not have online connectivity, and there is a potential for a social unrest unless we are able to manage economic implications in the right way and at the right time. So it is interesting because suddenly we are looking at higher education with these multiple lenses so that we can try to build new solutions. And once again, the aspect of the fourth industrial revolution gets amplified. So in terms of inclusive online education, these are some of the key areas. There is the aspect of curriculum. There is the aspect of pedagogy, or how we deliver the curriculum to our students. There's the aspect of assessment. Then there's the aspect of quality assurance or accreditation, like the business of ICASIT. Then there's the aspect of research, relating both to COVID-19, research in general, but research also relating to the scholarship of teaching and learning. And on the other side, I have these pillars that we must keep in mind of inclusivity, of innovation, of integrity, and of infrastructure, as there's more data in terms of internet traffic that is in the internet space or the channels, much more than ever before. And in many parts of the world, in South Africa, the amount of data has exceeded by 30 to 40% relative to the pre-COVID-19 period, simply because there's a lot of online activity. Now, as a university, we have commenced with our online activities on the 20th of April, which was after a 3-week period of lockdown. And we are obviously gradually phasing in aspects such as assessment, so that students as well as academic staff members who are less acquainted with the component of online education have some time to phase into this period. Now, while I present this, there is another very important dimension to keep in mind that is also happening. Is as all of this online world is progressing, on the other hand, we're also seeing aspect of cybersecurity that is increasing. And we are also seeing that, data is being collected much more than ever before. And the data is sometimes being collected in silos. So higher education might be collecting this data. You may have another provider, maybe it is your electricity provider, maybe it is your water provider that is also collecting some data. Now, data collected on its own may still have ethical clearance in how the data is being used. But as you know, and as many of you know, because you're coming from an engineering background, is that data collected in silos on its own may have ethical clearance, but data, when it is fused together, it may have new dimensions which we may not have understood in terms of ethical clearance, and it inevitably has the potential of compromising privacy. So it is something to keep in mind, and the ethics of how data is collected needs to be kept in mind. And at the same time, we know that in the dark web, we have had leaks of passwords. For example, Zoom. Zoom is one of the platforms that we use at the university. And as many of you know, that there has been Zoom hacks where Zoom passwords have been in the dark web and bots have taken that over, hackers have taken that over. And there is always a potential that there may be a hack during an online session. So we have to be much more alert in terms of security aspects when it comes to online education. Now, when it comes to delivering the curriculum, there are six tenets which has been written by Sarki Gravitt, who is a professor and our executive dean of the Faculty of Education. And these tenets, and you can read, so I won't emphasize all of them, but there are some interesting things about how learning occurs. Now, one aspect that comes out here is the aspect of emotion and cognition, which is intertwined. And when people are in a classroom, when they're interacting with you in person, there is that aspect where certain aspects that we learn is not only from a cognitive process, but is also through an emotional process. Areas that a facilitator or an educator emphasizes, how the emphasis, the approach, and how it emotionally assimilates with the learner is one way of learning. It's not always very apparent, but it's important. It's not something that we can easily do in an online platform. It's not that it is something that we cannot do. It is possible to do, and it is something that is evolving in the online space. And I suppose that as technology develops with virtual reality, with augmented reality, our ability to be able to interact also emotionally using technology then develops. But it is really at an infancy when it comes to developing the aspect of emotional intelligence using technology. And thus, our proposal and thinking is eventually to have an augmented reality or augmented set of interventions that involve both the real world learning experience as well as the online learning experience. How we will do this and for which academic disciplines would we do this will vary. In programs such as engineering, the aspect of practical work is very important. But how do you do the practical work if you're in a lockdown and people are separated by distance? And in some cases, like in our situation, they're displaced around the continent of Africa. How does one then do the practicals and still ensure quality assurance? And those are some of the things we'll just chat about. I thought I'll throw this on. Now, one of the things that I do really believe in, I was in a teaching position for about 12 or actually more than 12 years. And one of the aspects that really is something that I have always felt is a Benjamin Franklin statement that says it's simple. It says, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And that I think, particularly for engineering organizations, I think that's very important, is that the aspect, a lot of engineers in their final year project or the capstone project really tell you that they start to make sense of what engineering entails, because the project work, the capstone project, brings different concepts of engineering, mathematics, sciences together. And so the involve me and I learn is perhaps a very important aspect. That takes me to the next component, which is of pedagogy, which is how we deliver curriculum. Now, what is true is how we learn actually is very different. How people learn is different, and we have often in the classroom environment made certain assumptions that people probably learn similarly, and those assumptions have had its value, but on the other hand, those assumptions may have also compromised individuals who may learn differently. Now, interestingly enough, in the online world, there is a component of inclusivity that comes about as one very obvious case is that lectures can be archived and people can go back to those lectures. They can have emphasis areas, and the instructor, if the student has allowed for collecting the data or has opted in to collect data, the lecturer or the instructor can get that information and at an aggregate level can then see what are the areas of that particular module or course which is difficult for students to get a complete grasp of. So that's an interesting component of using data as a way to inform, your education approach. The role of mobile phone is very different. When we engage with the mobile phone, we don't engage with the mobile phone in the same way as we engage with a computer or in the classroom. In a classroom, our attention span is likely to be more than with a mobile phone, where, if you look at your mobile phone, you look at it for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, not usually more than 5 minutes, and then you put it away, and then you go and do something else, then you look at the mobile phone again. So when we are delivering our videos, it often has to be short clips. And the short clips is also important for countries that may be data challenged, or data may be expensive, so that the individuals can download at a lower cost. Another important component of inclusivity is languages. So for example, Jose and Ikasit are recording this session, and they will make this available later on an online platform. Now, in the past, you can, of course, a number of you can follow me in English, but some of you may be struggling with English, or you may be finding that I speak too quickly, or my accent is problematic for you. But the good news is that, on YouTube as well as on the Zoom platform, automatically translation is possible, transcription is possible, allowing for self-paced or paced learning, which we have not been able to do as easily in the classroom environment. I did talk about virtual reality and augmented learning. So we're able to include ways of learning, and also for persons with disability, or as we often say, people who are differently enabled are able to learn. They can follow the text more easily. And as you are aware that we are also looking at sign language, and being able to convert from sign language, we're able to communicate to persons who have a sight disability, to be able to communicate in terms of voice, and be able to translate that voice into Braille, into different type of communication. So there is another component of that. Now, I did talk about data ethics earlier on, and we are able to utilize, for example, we use at the university a tool called Blackboard, which has an artificial intelligence engine called Blackboard Predict. And Blackboard Predict, if it is enabled, can determine if there is a student who is not quite engaged with the different learning material that is available. And then we are able to help the student if the student has opted in, and we're able to say that there is perhaps a early caution that you need to engage in your learning material, and if you can't, then how can we help you in engaging with that? And that is if the person has opted into those programs. So suddenly the value of data as in progressing the individual becomes more pronounced. On the other hand, if you are in programs such as in engineering programs where you need to do lab work, and lab work needs to be done hand in glove to be able to project your learning experience, and it is not as easy. Now, in our case, we have some students who are stuck in poor parts of the country, or in other parts of the country where they may not have a reliable source of electricity. Meanwhile, the module that we are dealing with is on electrification. And then, the question is, how do you use local technologies, whether it is with water, or whether it is with solar solutions, or using other forms of energy conversion, whether it is the dynamic effect? How do you use these alternative technologies to be able to build a project next to the community and with the communities, so that you are still able to bring about that practical experience that supports one's learning. So we've had to be really thinking out of the box, unusually to what the classroom environment means. On the other hand, we are getting some very interesting feedback from our students who have learned about the cost of electricity in the city, but have never experienced how do you actually realize an electrification in the rural area. And so now they're building solutions in their own environments. And they're starting to see those multiple areas of social dynamics, of techno-economics, of earth systems, and of geopolitics integrating together into their learning experience. Now, we are, of course, saying, how do we bring about an academic framework over what they are doing in their local areas so that we can assess and so that we can bring about an examination framework over that? Now, this is something we've tried to do in the past. We've tried to take some of our learning into communities and into the real world and give students a real world experience. And we have battled, when we have tried to do that, we have often reverted back into the traditional lab environment where it is very technically oriented, and we know that students have to ultimately contribute into the real world. And so suddenly areas that we have had challenges with, and they are still part of the graduate attributes of a program such as in an engineering program, which has multiple graduate outputs, including the social implications of technology, including the aspect of project and program management, including the aspect of being able to work with and engage a people-centered solution. So it is not simply a solution for technology that enables technology, but it is a solution that enables technology to serve humanity. And so suddenly all of that starts to come together. I mentioned virtual mobility earlier on, and I also mentioned the aspect of vertical integration. What we experience is that, we only have so many academics at the institution, and the type of project variations that are occurring here is actually quite extensive. So how do we deploy an alumni into an online environment? How do we deploy a senior student to a first year class so the senior student can assist the professor in delivering and expanding the support for that person to be able to deliver a high quality learning experience? Now, in the past, we have struggled now to bring about an alumni into the mix, to bring about quality control. Suddenly, we find that we are able to do that because people find themselves in a space where they have flexibility and control over their time. So they are able to give back time to us, which we have not been able to get as easily in the pre-COVID-19 period. So some interesting kind of things is happening where humanity is coming together. Now, students have to think outside the box, so they have to be innovative. They have to look at local materials to try and achieve what their curriculum is asking for. This is something we've also been understanding, that the future world of work will change. And we are finding that this environment is enabling that. Now, I did talk about the laboratory earlier on, but there are interesting things there as well, where you are able to remotely use aspects of the lab by using tools such as Labster, by using things like, some of the 3D printing that you saw earlier. We were able to do that during a lockdown using a tool called Octoprint because it gave us remote access to the laboratory. Now, to be very honest, that tool has been in existence for a while, but we have not really used it in the past because we were not forced into that situation. Now that we are forced in that situation, we are starting to catalyze and start to use these tools and then say, what does it mean for somebody who is at a 500 kilometers from here? How can that person utilize the same equipment and develop their learning experience using that virtual or remote ability? Now, I'm going to move quickly on to the next part. This is just on the research slide, that there's a lot of data that is being accumulated by the learning management system. And this can help to feed into the scholarship of teaching and learning. It can also really force us to think in terms of inclusivity, is how do we actually develop an inclusive approach so that students are not left behind. At the same time, we must understand that there is a real wellness issue. Some students are coming from poor environments, or they are not staying always with their parents. They may be staying with their grandparents. Their grandparents may be more likely to be affected by the coronavirus. And all of these things is putting a lot of stress on them. The online education experience is new, it is adding stress. And so what we've also tried to do is to bring them into connectivity, whether it is by telephone, whether it is by online means, whether it is peer-to-peer support, so that they can engage with others, including on social media, but in an appropriate way, so that they are finding themselves supported psychologically. But all of this also generates some data, and it generates a new space for those people who are involved in the environment of social work, because that means they have to be able to engage in a different way to what they normally did. Now, assessment, which is very key, particularly for accreditation bodies, because we have always wanted assessment which is consistent, but the norm for that consistency becomes challenged. And now we have to think about an academic framework or a framework for assessment, recognizing that that framework may be consistent. However, the different type of projects that lend to developing students and their graduate attributes, those individual projects might actually be different, we may not be able to have the same project in different environments and in different areas. And so how do we use the concept of this framework, which then enables for consistency and to ensure that graduate attributes are attained in a similar way, which will then help for academic accreditation? How do we engage external examiners into this mix so that there's external moderation and the quality assurance processes can still be emulated? Of course, one can have computer-based evaluation and utilize electronic proctoring or moderation that does things like a combined approach of using biometric recognition to ensure that it is the student that is taking the assessment. So there are those traditional modalities as well. And I'm almost putting that as a traditional modality, and I'm doing that on intention. I'm doing that because, including myself and a number of others who are in academia for a long time, we find ourselves very much embedded in traditional ways of delivering education. And I think that the COVID-19 period is challenging us and saying perhaps the world needs to think differently, and maybe that is the normality that we have been seeking. And that going back into the old way may not necessarily be the best way. So from an accreditation point of view, there are certain benefits. There is an accreditation process is sample-based. People come in, they look at your different files, they look at exam papers, they look at what is the textbook. And if you think about it, a lot of those things also have a routine component. How do we use the learning management system, which is an online system, to automate part of those routine systems? And if we're asking program evaluators to go and engage with routine processes, we must maybe ask, is that what we want of program evaluators? Can we automate what they do in terms of the routine process using machine learning algorithms, because we are accumulating so much data? Can we utilize that data to automate parts of it so that the accreditation and the program evaluation component is based on a narrative? It is based on a qualitative engagement process where we are able to intellectually engage and automate parts of an accreditation process which is redundant. And I think that there is some room for us to be thinking outside of the box once more, also in the accreditation area. Now, I will be concluding that, we know pandemics. The last pandemic was almost 100 years ago, the big pandemic of the Spanish flu. And at that time, we saw that the world changed after that. If we go back several centuries, we find that, I think it was Newton who once said that, some of the gravity and his experience of gravity and, equations and formulation of gravity actually came about due to the lockdown. And so pandemics have had this ability despite the fact that the period and the time feels negative, that there are opportunities that emerge, and how do we take the best of what is coming out of during this period, retain, sustain, and grow that kind of thinking. So that the post-corona world is a world that we have shaped and not a world that we have been shaped by. The last part is the aspect of the competitive and collaborative landscape. Now I know several friends that are here at this particular workshop, and I can see that some of you are also adding to some comments. And I suppose that in the pre-corona world, we may have tried to engage differently, perhaps in person, perhaps scheduling would have been much more difficult because travel takes time. But suddenly we're able to find new friends. How do we retain those friendships so that we're able to utilize that collaborative landscape? So there is a real opportunity for us. There are also certain dangers, like the cybersecurity, the aspect of leaving people behind in the aspect, those that cannot be connected. But at the same time, to expand on online connectedness such that we can use that as an avenue to build inclusivity. Now, Jose, with those words, it is 6 p.m. and we started about 10 minutes late, so I'm going to switch over to you to see if we have some questions or comments. So over to you, Jose.
Thank you, Saurabh. We have one question. What do you think will be the impact of online education of the achievement of competencies?
I think that, the initial feeling is that we may actually have, some challenges, because how do you bring about and evaluate competencies in the same way? I suspect that, obviously we are in the first phase where we are evolving in terms of the, I use the word graduate attributes. We are evolving, and how do we ensure that graduate attributes is developed across a set of academic programs. Now, if I take the aspect of social implications of technology, that is one of the graduate attributes that also features within the Washington and Sydney Accord. If I take that one and we start to say, how do we, as a provider of that engineering program, how do we ensure that the social implications of technology have been understood? And if we then ask from there, if we start to look at what are the examples that are amplified by the COVID-19 situation, then we actually start to see that the competency can be built because we start to look at, we may start to look at 5G, we may start to say, well, what are the implications of, having masks next to each other? And in that process, we may start to debate that, how does 5G and 4G compare in terms of, electromagnetic radiation? And when we start to question those aspects, we start to find that we actually have to understand and engage with people who are not engaged with technology, and be able to engage with them so that they can understand what does it mean in terms of radiation when we start to work with the millimeter wave. So suddenly you start to look at that particular competency emanating from social implications of technology as something that we have only done in the classroom environment, to something that we actually have to engage and work with people when it comes to delivering that. So I would say that, we have an opportunity to actually embed and ask those difficult questions still in the online environment, and it needn't necessarily be compromised. If we find ourselves feeling compromised, it may be our immediate reaction, because in our immediate reaction, we may be feeling that this one will not work for us. Now, I've seen the next question, and it is not necessary for you to translate, Jose. I am using an online translator, so I'm able to see the translation. And the question that was asked is how to to assess the achievement of learning outcomes in remote education. And so here, if we take the approach of building an academic framework, and so I build an academic framework that perhaps has, maybe it is a matrix, and it's also a metric. And in this matrix, imagine a two-dimensional matrix. I have the competencies that are listed in terms of, one competency might be project management, another competency may be engineering design, another competency might be the social implications, another competency might be engineering ethics. And these may be on the one dimension of your metric. And on the other dimension, maybe the technical aspects of the project. And the technical aspects of the project might be on electrification. Now, the student then goes and implements the electrification in an area where the person is, because the person may not be able to come to Johannesburg, maybe very far from Johannesburg, in terms of being able to demonstrate that. The person then develops a report based on their experience in terms of this metric, and they then demonstrate to the provider how those have been attained. If it is a senior module, like a capstone module, where maybe the number of students are less, then the student can be engaged on an online platform to be able to assess that those learning outcomes have been achieved. Another student could have, again, the same framework. A framework may be the same, but the project may be different. So the metric is then applied on a different project, so that we can then consistently ensure that different students with different environments interact and are able to produce a reporting for us, which is the evidence, and are able to use that evidence to provide and ensure that those learning outcomes have been attained. Of course, it has to be guided by the supervisor, because our students are working under supervision, so they have to ensure that there is not an accident in what they have done. So there are cautions in that area as well. So that was the second question that was asked.
We
I
have
don't think...
an additional question, please, Saurabh.
Yeah.
How could be managed the situation of international students with full-time enrollment in face-to-face classes, since some immigration regulations normally limit the amount of online instruction?
Yeah, this is actually a challenge. It's a real challenge that we are facing right now as a university, because when the lockdown was implemented at the end of March, we had proposed to our international students to stay in South Africa. But some of them, due to fear, due to their parents in different countries not knowing how long this lockdown will last, they decided to return to their home countries. Now, they are able to participate, 80% of those students are able to participate in an online environment. Now, the way things are looking, we have no idea when we are going to be out of lockdown. Even if we are out of lockdown in South Africa, their respective countries may still be in lockdown. So they may not be able to travel. So the situation is very real for us, what you're saying. So the question would be, for example, how do you attain a laboratory exercise if you do need to go and access a lab? So what we are trying to do is we are trying to partner with the local institution in that area and looking and evaluating the lockdown situation there to see whether the student is able to work with a local provider in terms of being able to attain what must be done on site in terms of the learning acquisition. This is not possible in all countries. It is sometimes very expensive. There are variations in terms of bringing about, how do you make sure that it is equitable or substantially equivalent as we would use in the accreditation world. And those are things that we are still trying to engage with. What is interesting, and there was a study done by Universitas 21, which is a group of 25 or so research intensive universities, is that virtual mobility may not have the same benefit as in-person mobility, but there are similar type of learning competencies that you can enable, and at times you can do more. So, for example, if I set up a lab using a virtual mobility, set of devices, and if you have a low cost something like a cardboard-based virtual glasses that you have made, and you use those virtual glasses to access our environment here in Johannesburg, you will of course not be there in person, but you will be able to get a sense of the environment under which that experiment is being conducted. Now, that is now in an engineering example. Now, I was recently engaging with a student who deals with international politics in areas where there's civil war. And in the past, his avenue for engaging that country or the countries or the region where there is a civil war has been in the format of interviews, by sometimes visiting the area and by doing a lot of interviews. Now, that is one model that the person is actually going to do. On the other hand, what is happening is that the same student is experiencing the same world where that civil war is by using Google Earth. Now, Google Earth is not real time. It is a static set of images that have been taken by the satellite at one given point. And that images have evolved over time as new data has been fed in. So the student was looking at Google Earth and examining this and could see new realizations that has been missed when it comes to doing interviews in the traditional way. So suddenly, there is a new component of virtual mobility that has come about, something we haven't imagined. So I think and suspect that also for engineering programs, we are going to find ourselves learning as we learn with our students what it entails in what does internationalization entail in this world post the coronavirus. So I hope I answered that, Jose. It was a bit long response, but I hope it gives and cultivates the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have another question from Jorge Bastante. Could you see it, please, Sarah?
Yes, I have actually just seen the question, and I've been able to translate it as well. And the question is that, you know, what would be our readiness when it comes to completely developed engineering programs that are remotely enabled, and what it would mean for companies, and what would it mean for acceptance by employers of this particular set of graduates. Now, what has also been interesting, as you know, the future world of work is something that we have been talking about at the university. We have been recognizing that it is also evolving. Now, we have been slow in implementing this evolution. So, for example, as a university, when we have defined employability, we have often defined employability as how many of our graduates will go and work for somebody. Now, what we are seeing in the last couple of years, and more so heightened during this coronavirus lockdown, is that students are saying that we actually can't now rely on being employed by someone. We have to have the mindset where we, in fact, become the employer. And so what we thought about as entrepreneur now is being thought about as a netpreneur. And so I suspect that the type of jobs will change. Now, what I also picked up, I went on to Inside Higher Education the other day because we had posted a job advert there. And when I was looking at it, I saw the category of working remotely. And when I clicked on it, I saw a number of jobs that are there. And I saw that all of those postings were recent. So suddenly I realized that people across borders from other countries are now posting jobs because they realize that you can actually work from home and it might even be more cost effective. And so we realize that the landscape of opportunities also continues to expand. Now, it is not that areas of manufacturing will sort of disappear. No, it will also be there in future. And so I think what will be needed is that we will need to work with our employers to say that the role of the university is to develop and graduate individuals who have the potential to serve your industry, but it is also your role as an employer to take the engineer in training further so that they become a registered or a professional engineer or professional technologist. And that it is not, it is a role that is a continuum between the education provider and you as the employer, especially if you're working in environments which has required, very type of traditional type of manufacturing. But I do also realize that companies, they are in great distress financially, many of them. And they are also saying, how do we do to adopt and adapt to different type of energy sources? Because the traditional models of energy that we had, people are going to say that the environment during the coronavirus period benefited. So how do we then evolve our own way of working so that we are able to find graduates who can work in different type of environments uh, from an earth system point of view and not only the locality of the industry. So I think that there is an opportunity to not just evolve the institution, but evolve to work with the world in terms of the opportunities that exist. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you, Saurabh. On behalf of ICASID, I would like to thank you for accepting our invitation to conduct this webinar. And I would like to thank you all for joining this webinar. I have a little information to share with you. I would like to invite you to attend and participate in our symposium. And you can send your papers. New dates has been established, and our paper or our presentations will be conducted in a virtual manner. And also we will have another interesting activities, including in the symposium, like some workshops, keynote speakers, and new opportunities for networking. And we also want to invite you to apply to our program of ICASID New Evaluators. And you can find some information more information in our webpage about this program. And I would like to invite to participate in our next webinar. Thank you all for your participation, and I would like to see in the next webinar. Thank you, and good morning, and
Right.
good
Thank
evening
you,
for you,
Jose.
Sarah.